Ultimately, we want to be provocative, but also to make sure that you guys begin to understand the general principles which must be applied to take something from a scientific exercise into something which is a clinical and commercial one. Eric and I both agreed that we're going to speak very quickly so we can get to Gene up as quickly as we can. But until then, I'm going to give a background to really three things. One is the change in product complexity. So when we talk about therapies which are for age-related disease, historically, they've pretty much fallen in the bucket of small molecules or enzymes. Now, we're really looking at approaches which are complementary to that, but involve stem cells and gene vectors. And they have unique regulatory challenges, but also unique opportunities. To accommodate these new products, there's a series of new regulatory pathways which are flexible, they're adaptive, and actually these have fundamental impacts not only on the time to market and the amount of money required to get them to the market, but on the flexibility of decisions you take in the development path. For example, manufacturing. So historically, you would keep evolving your manufacturing process until the end of a phase 2 trial, at which point it's locked down. You can't change it, you're stuck with it for better or worse. But with these adaptive approaches, you're being forced to lock down earlier, which is a blessing and a curse. You're getting to market quicker, but with a process which isn't necessarily debugged, if you will. Then finally, I'll wrap up with a small note about the interaction between manufacturing and IP, but for truly breakthrough therapies. There are a large number of incentives to increase patent life in order to reward companies for taking that long 20-year journey from research to clinical adoption. However, patents are the domain of the Patent Office, and regulation is the domain of the FDA, and never shall the two speak. Therefore, we have a few perversities which have arisen recently, which I think are important for you to be aware of, but also something which, from a policy recommendation standpoint, we hope that you in the room today and those listening at home will help us change. So these are all the reasons you shouldn't believe a word I say. So, first and foremost, this is the pharmacopoeia as we see it today. Small molecules are still the highest volume part of the healthcare market, but biologics, monoclonals, are where pharma are making the majority of their money. But moving forward, the thing which we are really interested in are the regenerative approaches, the cell therapies, the immunotherapies, and the gene therapies. More futuristically, I know there's some guys from Wake Forest in the room today, tissue engineering approaches also fall within this remit. Each of these has added an additional layer of complexity and an additional element of stress to the regulatory pathway, because simply it wasn't designed to accommodate these therapies. But I am not from the school of thought which says the FDA should adapt immediately and they don't listen to us. I actually think the agency is incredibly responsive if we are willing to engage with them. And that is a joint responsibility at all stages of the pipeline, whether you're a basic researcher or somebody who's at the commercial applied end. And obviously, the big elephant in all rooms at the moment is big data. What do we do with this data, not only from a pharmacovigilance viewpoint to support new product developments, but actually, as we're moving to treating age-related diseases, where we treat chronic diseases or manage them over a long time period, or indeed give things which prevent the accumulation of damage, how on earth do you monitor the outcomes to ensure that pharmacovigilance and safety are looked after, but also make sure that the provider is appropriately reimbursed if it works or not? So post-market surveillance is a huge unmet need. Also, there's a few posters outside I saw yesterday which really talk about tissue-engineered approaches. There's a thymus there and any other organ you can think of. In reality, whilst incredibly scientifically interesting, these have a number of unique opportunities and challenges to get to market, not least because they follow a leverage combinational path, if you will, where there could be a device and a transplant, a device and a therapeutic, cells plus a scaffold. All these paths are established, but there simply isn't a lot of data to inform our plans. So for those of you who may not be aware, to go from one side of a screen to the other is about 20 years, and there's about a 5% chance of getting from one side to the other. Our aim is to reduce the time it takes to get from one side to the other, to reduce the cost, and also to make sure that we take increasingly novel therapies from one side to the other. Where we are historically is that when we talk about manufacturing, where Eric and Kim come in, the process you have in a phase 2 is the process which you have when you go to market. So in a crude sense, here, when you're doing basic research at the Buck or in the SENS RC, you're culturing things in 96-well plates or tea flasks. That isn't reproducible at an industrial scale. It's not a closed system, and the regulator doesn't like it. But it does the job perfectly well, because why do you want to go to the additional expense of closing it down? As we move through this process, this is where contract manufacturers would typically jump in and take the art out of the process. But today, you can't sell your product and seek reimbursement until you have completed a phase 3 trial. Actually, the argument goes that if you've got all the way to a phase 3, the product is quite de-risked anyway. If there's a high unmet medical need, why don't we simply let patients, subject to enhanced pharmacovigilance, access it earlier? Therefore, welcome to the era of adaptive licensing. So the nomenclature you may have heard here are adaptive pathways in Europe, or FDA breakthrough status. And essentially, it breaks the clinical trial path into 3 parts. In other words, making the clinical adoption of your science substantially closer. So after you've done your R&D, which we all love and get lots of papers from, your phase 1 and 2 trials essentially are designed to assess safety and some efficacy. By doing a slightly larger phase 2, the hope is that whilst you are conducting your phase 3 trial, you can get a conditional approval. So that allows you to get reimbursement for the product, improving your cash flow. It allows patients to get treated. And it also ensures that actually all the momentum built up by disease-specific organisations and patient groups is leveraged really quickly. Because anybody who's been through a trial will know there's tons of hype when you leave a phase 2. Every patient group wants to work with you. And then all of a sudden, when you disappear into a phase 3 trial that costs $30 million and takes 5 years, everyone's disappeared and assumes you won't get to the end of it. So I think this point is really critical. Earlier, controlled patient access. And this is a huge opportunity for everybody in this room, but actually this process has some nuances insofar as it's applied to age-related diseases. So if it's actually for a chronic condition and you're providing accelerated access, it may take some time for you to understand, is that therapy working or not? But also, if we're going to look at preventing the damage in a proactive way, actually, how do you structure that study? What is your endpoint and when is your endpoint? Now, all this sounds quite theoretical, but I want to stress that actually this has had a tremendous impact on the rate of innovation. So in 2013, which I think is when these conferences moved out to the West Coast, there were approximately 15 approved cell or gene therapies. A year later came FDA breakthrough status and adaptive licensing, and today, just in gene therapy alone, there are 18 products going through an adaptive path. A lot of these are for cancers, but in particular pediatric indications, ALL, etc. And the pipeline is incredibly strong. So Pfizer alone, because of this path, have 14 CAR-T products going through the pipeline. They wouldn't be doing this unless, A, there was a high medical need, but these regulatory incentives were in place, and I urge you all to look at them. So when we look at what are the big stories of the past couple of years in this area, it's always the Novartis Kite, Selectis, Junos, Adaptimmune, and Spark which crop up. All of these companies, their premise is built upon this process of FDA breakthrough status, getting their therapies to market quicker. So all this sounds wonderful, but actually, what are the key challenges which you guys need to understand and overcome to make sure your therapies go through this path smoothly and manage the risk to the patient? So in the US, a substantial pot of money has been made available by the NCATS program, so led by Chris Austin, and this is really designed to get basic science to the clinic much, much quicker. And within there are specific provisions to encourage people to go down the breakthrough status route. However, a grant is a wonderful thing, which academics love coming around the honeypot. But when you start to understand the regulation behind it, that's where things get slightly lost. So fundamentally, adaptive approaches are iterative. So the idea is you come into the top and say, well, is a conventional pathway already committed? So if I'm bringing something to the market for an existing indication, if I have a blood pressure tablet, is that really a breakthrough? Is there a high medical need? Actually, is this the best recipient? No. But then, actually, if it is something which is truly transformative, particularly for an orphan indication, then there's these series of feedback loops at every single stage of development. And that creates a lot of interaction between the regulator and the scientist, which people haven't been historically used to. But in the past year, there were 48 applications for this program, of which the majority were actually led by academics. Of the 40-plus applications, 24 were accepted within a year. So this means that 24 products are in the pathway quicker than they would have been before. They've got access to funding they wouldn't have before. And in addition to that, their path to market is just a tremendous amount shorter. Now, for those of you that don't necessarily follow the space hugely, and I know there's some companies in the room which have some therapies like this, the doyen of the field at the moment is the joy of CAR T. Essentially, taking a patient's cells in an autologous approach, a manufacturing platform, activating certain properties of the cells, and turning these immune cells into cancer fighting as opposed to cancer honing. And in this process, the scale-up is incredibly challenging. And it's something which most of the time academic investigators wouldn't bother about until they had an industrial partner. So you go through this process and you keep changing your technologies. You simply cannot change as much in an adaptive approach. But I will leave you with a little bit of a perversity, which is now really starting to crop up in the US. And it's the principle of patent exclusivity. So because it takes a long time to get to market, you can get a series of incentives, such as supplementary protection certificates, to increase the life of your patent. And any patent attorney at the Buck will be very familiar with filing these. But they are based upon the premise that it takes X years to get a product to market. And you must have a marketing authorization from the FDA. Adaptive licensing, which we're all loving and going after now, decreases that amount to a shorter amount of time. So you may not be eligible for these incentives. But also, if the marketing authorization is withdrawn, because it's conditional in a phase 3, then the entire patent life can actually be shortened. So what we're seeing now is potential for negative term intellectual property. And I think yesterday, in one of the presentations, the new lobbying power of academic research centres was noted, and this is absolutely a key area. There's 2 cases going on in the moment in Europe where for a CAR T indication, so a cell and gene therapy for a paediatric cancer, the patent has actually been shortened in length because the law was never written with regulation in mind. So I think the key message here is, do not think that everybody in this room isn't part of the same team in trying to get products to market. But what we need to do is go from, instead of collaborating in new ways, which meant make sure you get a physicist on your team and a biologist, we now need to look beyond to the other stakeholders and engage with regulators and in particular tool providers earlier. Because ultimately, and Eric, I'm sure, will cover this in a great amount of detail and in a very erudite fashion, the tools which you guys need tomorrow, the need just went down from in 3 years' time to a year's time. And now the tool providers have got to accelerate their development pathways as well. So we need to be clearer in our lines of communication to achieve that. So, long and short is there are new approaches out there. I think they are absolutely applicable to age-related disease, both the prevention and the correction of damage. I don't think that the regulation was written with this in mind, and I think it could pose one of the greatest challenges or opportunities to this regulatory pathway, perhaps other than vaccines, which is always the case study which is given. If you'd like to hear any more, there's some posters outside, or I'm around all day. And thank you for everybody who's paid for the research, in particular to SENS. And I changed the picture at the back because what a beautiful place it is. So thank you.